Right. Hello, everyone. Biopsychology. Um, not everyone's favourite, so I thought I'd do a brief video prepping for the biopsychology section of the 2025 exams. Again, as always, I'm not going to be going through necessarily what I think is coming up or making predictions, but just things to be prepared for within the biopsychology section. The first thing to know, I think, and it's the thing I've started with most of these videos, is 16 marks. This isn't so much a prediction, but I'd be very surprised if there was a 16 marker in the biopsychology section this year. 5 out of the last 6 years, the 16 marker in paper 2 has come up in biopsychology, not approaches. And it's been the last 4 years that it's come up in biopsychology. 4 straight years of biopsychology. Now, keep in mind, by the way, that they can only really ask you 16 marks, an essay on these 3. So the fact that it's come up 4 years in a row, and look, you can get a 16 marker in any of these approaches. So I'd be stunned. I would be flabbergasted if another 16 marker came up in biopsychology and not approaches. The only thing I might suspect AQA will do at one point is to, and they've never done this before, but to ask 2 16 markers in a paper 2, one in approaches and one in bio. They would only do that, I think, if they asked 2 16 markers in the first paper. But so I think a 16 marker is probably less likely. It came up in studying the brain 4 years ago, and then 2 years of the localization bullet point, and then last year it was biological rhythms. Could they ask another 16 marker in bio this year? Absolutely. But it wouldn't be on a question they haven't asked before. I think you're much more likely going to get a 16 marker in biopsychology. Now, regarding the first 3 or 4 bullet points, we've got divisions of the nervous system, neurons, synaptic transmission, endocrine system, and fight or flight. Bio, you have to know your technical knowledge. So what that means is that where half of it you don't need to know evaluations, you don't need to know how to evaluate the endocrine system or fight or flight or the nervous system, because these aren't theories as much as they are facts. So you can't evaluate that. So where you don't have to evaluate, you're going to have to really be hot on your technical knowledge. So we're talking about all the different types of nervous systems. You may know, you need to know the differences between the nervous systems, which I suppose is AO3. You need to know at least 3 glands, I think, for the endocrine system, and then what hormones come out of those glands, and then the function of those hormones. Fight or flight, you need to know the technical information, hypothalamus, recognition of threat or threat appraisal, the amygdala's involvement, telling the adrenal gland, give us everything. So you need to know all that technical knowledge. But I'm not really worried about that bullet point. From my own personal point of view, I think the hardest bullet point is the first bullet point of schizophrenia. If you take schizophrenia, of course, not everyone watching this video might. That's a bullet point beyond comprehension. But I think students think the hardest bullet point is this one, and they have a fair point. This one is an absolute heffalump of a bullet point. I think you've got at least 4 bullet points in there, rolled into one. Stupid hay fever. Okay, so localization and lateralization. You have to know the difference between localization and lateralization. If they ask you a question on either of them, you cannot mix up these 2 theories. So localization is about specific places in the brain having very particular functions. Again, know at least 3 examples of this, and you can go with the lobes. So lobes, you want to talk about localization. lobes and localization. If you talk about lobes and lateralization, not really answering the question, at least not correctly. So, localization, you want to talk about a definition, 3 examples of localized functions in the brain, Phineas gauge, and how that links to localization. So he blew the front of his head out, and his personality changed, and so we thought, oh, maybe his personality is where he's got a massive gaping hole in his head. And then maybe the idea about motor, somatosensory, visual, that sort of stuff. Now lateralization is about sides. So this is where hemispheres come in, contralateral working, split brain comes in. And so it's knowing what goes into what bullet point. Be careful about getting these mixed up. That's all I would say. It's the same thing for plasticity and functional recovery, really. Plasticity and functional recovery are different things. What happens if they ask you, an 8 marker on plasticity? Well, then you can't say the word damage, because that's about functional recovery. So plasticity is just how the brain responds to new experiences that you do, and how it molds and shapes. So you're talking about synaptic pruning and axon sprouting, synaptogenesis, structural plasticity, functional plasticity, and maybe bringing in Maguire or the video game one. Coon? I can't remember. Whereas functional recovery is anything to do with damage. Regeneration or all the factors about being female or the younger you are. Neural reorganization, neural unmasking. So you need to be able to make sure that you're answering the right question, because there's a lot here that they could go, right, an 8 mark on functional recovery specifically. And you're going to have to give very, very specific terms, not terms related to plasticity. Plasticity and functional recovery aren't the same thing. Ways of studying the brain, also be aware of. You need to know the technical information. What exactly does an fMRI actually measure? It's the removal of magnets and the measurement of hemoglobin, blah, blah, blah. You need to know the specifics. The differences between EEGs and ERPs. You need to know the differences between all of these, actually, because that could be a potential question. I don't know. Could be just an 8 marker. This would be a good one, actually. 8 marker, compare fMRI to EEG. Compare fMRI to EEG. Just 8 marker, no outline, just compare. So then you're looking at spatial resolution differences. fMRI, fantastic spatial resolution, down to 1 millimeter. Electroencephalogram, terrible. It's related to how many electrodes it has. It doesn't give a necessarily accurate picture of the brain. Temporal resolution. And for those of you who don't know, temporal resolution, because I don't think it's consistently taught clearly, temporal resolution is the time between your brain doing the behavior and it showing up on the scan. Now fMRI, it takes between 1 and 6 seconds to show up on the scan. That's far too long. Whereas EEG is a bit more rapid, it shows up immediately. And then I would go for expense, cost. fMRIs cost up to about 1.2 million, 1.5 million. They're pretty expensive. EEGs, far cheaper. You can get an EEG for about 900 quid. Top of the range is about 20 grand. So, easy one to go for. And finally, circadian rhythms. It did come up as a 16 marker last year. That's not to say it won't come up this year. But it is one thing that students aren't particularly strong at. What I think is worth pointing out, a couple of things. Divisions of the nervous system and neurons, as well as localization, lateralization, split brain plasticity, they haven't come up for 2 years now. Now, it's not guaranteed to come up, but I do think it probably is more likely to come up. I definitely think something in localization is going to come up. So it's something to be aware of. The last thing just to be aware of as well are some of these questions whereby they get you to apply your knowledge. Now, if we have a look at endocrine systems so far, if you have a look, everything has been AO1, AO1, AO1. They love a 4-marker endocrine AO1. In fact, it's pretty much all that's come up. Right? 4 markers in AO1. There's easily enough room for you to be able to have to do a 6-marker AO2 here. 6 marks. They've got a scenario with 3 people with different problems, and then you have to kind of apply the endocrine system to those 3 people and the 3 problems. For example, Gerald keeps having anger fits where he rages at his classmates, for example, and then you'd link that to testosterone, that sort of thing. Yeah, so I think biopsychology, less worried about the 16 marker, but you're really going to need to be hot on that technical knowledge. Hope this is useful. As ever, good luck.